Okay, so this week I'm going to continue the trend of last week and keep killing people with stupid busted combo decks in a format that lets me play all the most ridiculous cards ever. This week we have it's slightly derivative of Rich Shay's Storm List, which is in turn derivative of Reed Duke's Storm List from last year's Vintage Champs. Uh, so if you look at it, it looks, I guess, less dissimilar from a normal Vintage deck than Storm looks compared to a regular deck in a different format. And that's just because all the good restricted cards in Vintage are mana producers, and that's what you want in Storm anyways. So you really have to figure out what's actually setting you apart here. Because these mana cards, the only ones that Storm really plays that other people don't are Opal, Lion's Eye Diamond, and the Rituals. And that's not a significant amount more. Like Storm in like Legacy plays an additional 12 fast mana compared to another deck, and this is 6. And that's just a double up instead of like 12 versus 0 in a normal format. Because again, normal Vintage decks have like Lotus Petal, well, not necessarily Petal, Lotus Crypt, Mana Vault, Soul Ring, Mox, and all that stuff. So when you look at the deck and when you actually play with it, the thing that really sets Storm apart is these cards right here. More accurately, it's really this whole stack, but very specifically these cards, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But I want to kind of walk through basically everything else that leads to this. So we don't have Force of Will as our interaction, and that is because we don't want to support a lot of the other blue cards required to actually cast Force of Will. We have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, which I guess is in theory enough to cast it, but you actually want to get your cards to be cast, and you need a critical number of cards in hand to cast Tendrils of Agony, as opposed to just 2 to go Key Vault, or 2 to go Tinker into Colossus, and then have a counter up or a Time Walk. So actually casting Architaxian Probes as opposed to pitching them matters a lot. And you also don't have a lot of extra. Well, so like one of the things in Vintage that's really important is that pitching your counter spells to force is one of the better things to do a lot of the time, because it leaves you with cards that matter in hand. And this deck doesn't actually want those things. It wants more mana so it can cast its busted cards. So you're leading on Duress, which is definitely a sacrifice because there are decks that can attempt to do busted things against you that you can't force back. But in general, Duress is okay. There's a little bit of iffiness with mental misstep involved. We have our own misstep, which is a little iffy in my mind. I think it could just be pretty much anything else, but Reed had it, so I didn't change it, and I don't think Rich did either. And then we have our bounce spells. There's a chain as the... well, let's first talk about Hercules. Hercules is basically a requirement. You can find it against stacks, and it's a way to win the game. If they have actual lock pieces out, because this deck cannot actually do that with the current configuration. As you'll see, there's one win condition. It's the Tendrils of Agony. There's no Tinkerbot main. And basically, your planning in stacks is not to tinker them. It's you kill them on 1, you duress their sphere on turn 1 on the play, or you find a way to cast Hercules Recall and the game ends, presumably when you untap. So this card's obligated to be here, and you would want a second, except for game 1s you can't really afford to have double up on dead cards here. So you have Chain, which actually does a lot of work. The alternate mode of Chain of target my mana rock, sack all my lands, or turn all my mana rocks, recast them, and make mana actually comes up a lot in this format because you have a ton of Moxes. So Chain is actually kind of like a colorless or multicolored ritual in this deck, as opposed to Legacy where it comes up more as just blue, add 4 Storm if you're doing that. In this format, it's add 2 mana and 4 Storm. So we have our card draw. You'll notice that we are a deck that's playing Preordain, which implies that we have actual cards that we want to find. You'll notice I have Time Walk here in this stack because it's really not doing much else besides drawing a card in this list. And actually, again, similar to Doomsday, I could see cutting this card almost altogether from this deck, though it does have a couple more uses with the top of deck tutors. And I guess Doomsday has Necro too, but between these cards, there is the ability to, Vamp Tutor, Time Walk, and build a Grim Tutor, which is kind of a stupid use of the card, but it's about as good as it gets. It's also, you can do the early harvest trick with it, where you wheel and then Time Walk, and then Memory Jar or something like that would be my imaginary setup. Where if they counter a wheel, you might not have enough mana to cast your next draw 7, but if you Time Walk, it adds a bunch of mana from Moxes. So we have an access to tutors compared to most decks to find our busted cards. You'll notice that Imperial Seal and Grim Tutor in particular don't actually show up in a lot of other decks. Actually, a lot of lists I know have been eschewing the Grim Tutor or the Imperial Seal, but leaving in the Grim Tutor. But my understanding is that is also just because Imperial Seal is literally impossible to find, whereas Grim Tutor is only 30% impossible to find in real life. So take that with a grain of salt. And then you have the real meat of the deck, which is your broken cards. So the real incentive to play Storm in this format, like I said, is not the mana. It's the fact that you get to cast draw 7s, do things with them, and in particular, you get to cast the 3 one-sided draw 7s that exist in the format. When you cast a Twister, you have to worry about your opponent drawing Force. When you tinker for Jar, you have to worry about your opponent drawing Force. Same with, Windfall or Wheel. And I guess Yogg Will is a one-sided draw 7, but everyone knows about that. But the cards that people can't really play that you get to because you're Storm, you play a little bit more mana, are Yawgmoth's Bargain, Necro, and Mind's Desire. It is really hard to lose after you play these cards. Necro is good. It's the lowest investment one. You just kind of like Ritual Necro, and if they counter it, you're down 2 cards, and not a lot of board position or mana. Bargain basically immediately wins any game where it resolves. I don't know how many people have actually cast this card at this point, but it is comical that it was considered a fixed Necropotence at the time it was printed. And then Mind's Desire is an absurdly unique effect in the format. There really just isn't another card. Like, you can Force a Will any of these other cards in the deck to stop the Tendrils kill, but if you just have a Mind's Desire and your opponent counters, or doesn't counter your, Soul Ring randomly, the game ends. You Mind's Desire for 5 cards, you flip 5 things, even if, one's a land, which is about average with our 11 lands, another source of mana, a card draw, a tutor, and a draw 7, what are you going to do against that? Mind's Desire has just generated all the mana you spent into it and more, generated multiple threats. It's really unbeatable if you cast it, and it's literally the only reason I would ever play Flusterstorm in a deck is because I'm afraid of Mind's Desire. So yeah, you'll get to see it in action, but I think it's probably one of the most tutored 4 cards when I play this deck. And then obviously your 1 Tendrils to kill. You need some way to do it. Having only the Tendrils as opposed to Tendrils and a Tinkerbot can kind of make things tricky. There's turns where you'll have a Necro in play, and you can't draw 7 because your Tendrils is in your hand, or specifically Wheel of Fortune or Windfall. You'll have games where your Tendrils is in your hand, you have a Memory Jar, and you can't exile it to Memory Jar, or you have to pass a turn if you do that, or Time Walk, which is I guess another use for it, where you draw a ton of cards, set up some board state where you're going to kill them next turn, or where you get to set up another card draw for next turn with a Vamp, and then Time Walk, get back your Tendrils, and kill them. Also, there's the issue of if you have Tendrils, you can't crack LED after a Yogg Will and discard it because it would get exiled. So there's some work that you have to do, but I think that cutting the other dead draw is definitely worth it. One other thing of note is the interaction between Yawgmoth's Will and Cataxian Probe is absolutely ridiculous. Obviously Yawgmoth's Will plus spells is a combo, but Yawgmoth's Will that automatically draws you additional cards to cast is a bit more of a combo. Moving to the sideboard, you can see it's pretty straightforward. It's actually pretty awesome for a lot of reasons. So, first thing you'll see is traditionally vintage decks have up to 6 hate for Dredge. This deck only has 3, and I don't even know if they're all necessary. That's because Storm is one of the decks with the best inherent game against Dredge. You have a lot of turn 1, I don't want to say a lot, but you have a decent number of turn 1 kills that they can't really interact with. If you're on the play, you can kill them on turn 2 before they actually get to Dredge off of Bazaar. So you have all that. You have Time Twister as a way to main deck Graveyard Hate and reshuffle and force them to have to Bazaar again. You have all the draw 7s to fight back out of Cabal Therapy issues. And just overall, it's really hard to Cabal Therapy this deck out. You can hit Rituals, which is okay. But just because your deck is so many one of busted cards, it's just really difficult to actually figure out what you're supposed to hit with Therapy. And even if you have multiples, you typically find your opponent like whiffing on the first one, taking a card, and then you're still reasonably able to win the game the next turn. So you still want a little bit just as insurance, but it's not necessary. We have our Stacks Hate package, and I don't remember if Rich or Reed was the one who came up with this, but it is absolutely phenomenal. Um, we're going to board into basic lands so we can't get wastelanded. We're going to assume that if we don't kill them on one, they're going to cast some spheres, and we're going to have to deal with that. So we're just going to play a land every turn of the game until the point where we can cast a Hurkyl's Recall or Rebuild, at which point we end step that, untap, and the game ends. The rebuild is there in part because you don't want to draw a ton of, well, a few. You can time walk chain your opponent with recalls in theory, but it's not like the best thing to do. But realistically, people do play Witchbane Orb, so you do need to be able to rebuild that card because you can no longer target your opponent with Hurkyl's if that's the case. Finally, we have our anti-blue cards, Pyroblast, which is probably the next best interactive card besides Duress. It's particularly handy against. So one of the things the blue decks can do to compete with you is set up an early recall and ride that advantage to a win. And Pyroblast is really good at being the interactive spell that lets you counteract that game plan. So like a lot of the blue decks will like try to recall into snap recall, and you can just shut that down and kill them. Also worth noting that this is not like Legacy Storm where you have 4 Lion's Eye Diamonds. So counter spells like this are bad in that deck. They're actually fine in the deck because you're not discarding your hand to do things like you'll draw 7, you'll discard the Pyroblast, but who cares? Because Pyroblast didn't matter because they didn't have a counter if it resolved. We have our alt win cons, which come in. Empty is mostly for stacks. You can just sort of short tendrils them where you just like, oh, I can go off for like 5 Storm on turn 1 and make 10 Goblins. Good luck. I think Ratchet Bomb's pretty good in stacks, though, so some lists will get you, some won't. And then Blightsteel again, because you need a way to make Tinker into a kill con against stacks or against specific fish decks. On the subject of fish decks, Toxic Deluge is your Hurkyl's Recall there. If they have Mind Sensor, Spirit of the Labyrinth, Pride Mage or something like that in play, and you're like, I don't really want us to figure out how to deal with this, you can just tutor for Deluge, kill all their guys, and continue with the game. And by continue, I mean they lose. So there's less of those Null Rod fish decks than there are stacks decks, so not that much space committed to Deluges, but having the one is pretty important. So we'll get to see this deck in action a little bit. It's pretty cool. It's certainly not the same as Legacy Storm. It's probably a lot closer to Modern, actually. So hopefully some of these cards are ones that create some exciting game states.